Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Handford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Sunday edition of the Tough Decisions podcast. Thanks for joining me today. We're talking about a book called Blink, written by Malcolm Gladwell, and I am thoroughly enjoying reading through and thinking about this book, and there's so much information in this book. I'm actually going to skip chapter 2 today entirely, but I just encourage you to get a copy of this book and read it if you're interested in the way the human mind works and the way that we make decisions and the way sometimes that we make bad decisions in spite of having lots of information, and how some people can make great decisions with seemingly little information. This book really helps to explain and open up all of that. So I encourage you to grab a copy. On our website, we have a link to the copy of the book. So check that out and get a copy for yourself, because there is so much here. And I'm just faced with the task of trying to pick out the most important information and the things that I think will be most helpful to you guys that are listening. So really quickly, I wanted to sort of review the most important idea that we talked about last week, which was the theory of thin slicing. And remember that thin slicing is something that our brain does subconsciously, and it's really the ability that we have to find patterns in new situations and behavior based on very small slices of experience or narrow slices of experience, thus the term thin slicing. All of this happens subconsciously or unconsciously in what we refer to as our adaptive unconscious. Now, we talked a little bit about how we do this. We talked about several people who had experimented and done studies in the ability of the mind to perform this thin slicing process. And it's almost a bad thing to call it a process, because when I think of process, I think of long, drawn out process. But this happens very quickly, almost before we even realize it. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. In chapter 3, we're going to talk about something called the Warren-Harding error. And we'll get to that in just a second, but I just wanted to briefly touch on what's in chapter 2. The title of chapter 2 is called Behind the Locked Door. And in chapter 2, Gladwell really sort of tries to go into that subconscious, if you will, and sort of talk about, how this happens a little bit, if you can. It's a very complicated thing to try to describe, but I didn't really feel like that would be something that it would be beneficial to just really delve into. So I'm just going to skip over that. But it is very, very fascinating nonetheless. So let's jump right into chapter 3, which talks about some of the dangers of this thin slicing process that Gladwell is talking about. He calls it the dark side of thin slicing, and another way of looking at that is called the Warren-Harding error. And I'll resist the urge to give a detailed history lesson here, but just briefly to understand why it's called this and really what's going on is Warren Harding, you may recognize the name as one of our presidents, our past presidents. And to put it bluntly, Warren Harding was perhaps one of the worst presidents we've ever had. According to most historians, people who look and study politics and history in the United States, really he didn't do anything to contribute to the progress much of the United States. And even up until the point that he was elected, most people felt like he was just sort of, a non-factor. Long story short, he had served in public office on the state level and also in Congress. and really just done nothing. He was absent in the issues of prohibition and women's suffrage, which were basically the biggest issues of his time. He basically didn't have a voice at all or a position, not at least one that he made public. And he was really more or less the puppet of a man named Harry Daugherty. And Daugherty saw in Warren Harding someone that he could promote and use. And the question becomes, well, what was it about Harding that attracted Harry Daugherty and made him feel like this was someone that he could push and install, if you will, into public office? And the answer to that question is nothing more than Harding's good looks. And so Daugherty saw in Harding someone that people would be attracted to, that people would believe, they would trust, and that they would want to be their leader, not because of anything that he believed or had done or any accomplishments, but simply because of the way he looked. And so the question then becomes, what happens if our rapid cognition ability is somehow interrupted or we never make it below the surface? So the thing about thin slicing that makes it so powerful is that it's an ability to get below the surface of a situation very quickly. Because our ability to thin slice, we can see patterns in new situations and behaviors, and those patterns are typically not going to be overt and obvious. So the thing that makes it so powerful is getting below the surface. What happens if we're not able to do that? Or what happens if the process is interrupted and we never actually make it below the surface? As in the case of Warren Harding, thousands of people never made it below the surface, if you will, in Harding's good looks. And so if we're to get to the point where we trust these quick decisions that we can make with our adaptive unconscious, then we also have to be able to recognize the situations where our rapid cognition may lead us astray and may suffer from this interference that we're going to talk about today. So this interference is typically caused by, most psychologists refer to as unconscious associations or implicit associations. In fact, there have been tests developed called implicit association tests that help to point out the ideas that we already have paired together in our mind. So here's kind of how it works. And I'm just going to use a very, very simple illustration, but I think you'll see. So we have the two genders of male and female, and in our minds, we have associated a number of objects, activities, colors, names associated with both genders. In fact, if I gave you a list of names, it wouldn't take you even a second for each one to automatically, in your mind, pair that name with either male or female. Those are implicit associations. But we also make decisions based on these associations, and that can be harmful when those associations or those attitudes that we have are actually contradictory to what we would say we want or believe. So we also have associations with race, gender, any number of other categories, if you will. And sometimes those are okay. Sometimes we can make decisions fine with those associations. Sometimes they interfere and would keep us from making the best decision. There actually are a number of tests, as I mentioned. They're called implicit associations tests, or IATs. And interestingly enough, if you ever want to take an IAT, you can go to a website, www.implicit.harvard.edu, and there are a number of implicit association tests there that you can take. You can go through the process yourself, and they'll actually use your information and your answers and things to be a part of their research. Another example of how this works would be height and leadership or position in a company. So the author, Malcolm Gladwell, did a study where he polled half of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States. And what he found was that an inordinate number of the CEOs in those companies were what he would categorize as tall. And he did this research because in the past there had been studies that showed that height was a determining factor in how easy it was to follow or trust a leader. If they're higher, we have positive associations with the height, with a taller person. So he polled half of the Fortune 500 companies, and what he found were, of the male CEOs, a number of them were just under 6 feet tall. Now, we might say, well, big deal. What's the big deal about that? And of course, it was also fairly obvious pretty quickly that an inordinate number of them were male, but we'll talk about that in just a minute, male as opposed to female. But male CEOs the average was just under 6 feet tall. Now, the average American male was 5'9". So automatically you go, okay, so the average American male is 5'9". You would think that, the average American CEO, when you factor in, that you're taking a cross section of the population, that they're going to be around 5'9". It was actually 3 inches taller. The average male CEO was just under 6 feet tall. Now, take it a step further. Around 14.5% of all American males were over 6 feet tall, but among the CEOs, over half of them were over 6 feet tall. And Gladwell actually took it even a step further in going over 6 feet 2 inches was 33% of the CEOs. So the reason that's different is that you could actually say, well, more of them were male than female too. But we could actually have a little bit of an explanation for that because of other cultural factors. For a long time, we could probably say, well, there weren't enough females with experience or with the abilities needed to serve as a CEO, so that's why the percentage of them was smaller. And that would explain some of that, but not when you're just looking at one gender like that with the male. It would seem, and to be a category that was completely out of human control, so to speak. So what he is finding and what he is bringing out is that were tall people just more qualified for that position of CEO? Well, no. Height really has nothing to do with your ability to lead people and make decisions for a company. But when they're being interviewed, height might be a factor that affects how they interview and how they are interviewed. And so what he found was this height that had these positive associations with it affected the choices that were made for leader of a company. So this does help explain how some mediocre leaders might get positions with, unbelievable responsibility, or how very good leaders never get an opportunity because of things that are out of their control. And then the question becomes, how do we combat this interference of implicit associations? Because we all, I think, would agree that, well, that's not good. We don't want the interference because then we can't trust our decisions. We can't rely on our rapid cognition if it's so easily thrown off by these surface level interfering factors. The ability to conduct the rapid cognition is reliant on our ability to get below the surface. And if the surface level factors can interfere so easily, then how can I ever trust the decisions that my adaptive unconscious comes to? Well, we're going to talk further about that as we continue to move through the book. But one thing that's interesting is that Gladwell points out that, well, how do we develop these associations? Well, it's through our experiences in our environment. Our culture, if you will, and the way that we have experienced life and the environments that we have been around affect these implicit and actually develop these implicit associations. So how do we combat the interference? Well, we change our experiences in our environment, and we make a concerted effort to affect the associations that we have, these implicit associations, by exposing ourselves to particular experiences and particular environments. Just a quick example of how that works. The several people who had taken the race IAT, so the implicit associations that we typically have for race, there is one specific IAT that tests that. And so they had an individual that was taking this race IAT over and over and over, trying to change his score and trying to change, if you will, the implicit associations that he had. I guess that's a respectable thing. He wasn't comfortable with the fact that, he said he valued all people, and he said that he was able to make equitable decisions and not consider race. But this race IAT that he was taking kept showing that he did have negative associations with certain races. And so he wasn't comfortable with that, and he was trying to change it. And so what they found was that if he would look at certain pictures or watch certain video clips before he took the race IAT, then his score would improve. So just for an example, he had negative associations with the African American race. and he was trying to improve that. And what they found would improve his score no matter how many times he took it. Even though he already knew the answers, his score really basically changed none at all. But what they finally did come upon something that would change his score, and that was showing him pictures of successful Black people who had made positive contributions to society. Then that did actually improve his score. And so what we see then is that our impressions are actually generated by our experiences and our environment, as we already talked about. And by changing our experiences and our environment, then we can also change some of these implicit associations that we have. Now, that is the main ideas there in Chapter 3, which talks about the Warren Harding effect and the dark side of thin slicing, if you will. And that is, we have to be able to get below the surface of a situation. And typically our subconscious will do that on its own. But when there is interference and we are unable to get below the surface, then we can be affected by these associations that may or may not be accurate and can cause us to make a different decision than our subconscious or our unconscious would have done on its own. So keep that in mind as we proceed. Next week, we're going to talk about something called the structure of spontaneity, which may on the surface sound like a contradiction or a little bit confusing, but it's really not. It's quite fascinating. I think you'll agree that it really is a key to understanding how all this works. But keep this in mind. There is always the opportunity for our adaptive unconscious or our thin slicing to be interfered with. And so we have to be conscious of what's going on while also allowing our unconscious to work and being able to rely on those decisions. And we can rely on those decisions when we are aware of the things that can affect the decisions.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.